Hit subscribe, drop a comment, and stay until the end. The steel door slammed shut with a sound that didn't echo, it absorbed itself into concrete. Inside the cell, there was no shouting, no chaos, no visible violence. Just a tray sitting untouched on the floor. The inmate had been found unresponsive during a routine check at the federal Supermax in Florence, Colorado. No weapon, no blood, no signs of a fight. Just a man who had stopped eating. At first, officers assumed it was another hunger strike. Those happened. In a place like ADX Florence, the most restrictive prison in the United States, food is more than nutrition. It's leverage. It's protest. It's one of the only forms of control an inmate still has. But this was different. The medical report would later list complications related to severe malnutrition. Quiet words. Clinical. Detached. Yet behind those words was a question that would ripple through federal offices and investigative desks. How does someone starve inside a facility where every calorie is counted? ADX Florence rises from the Colorado desert like a fortress designed to erase hope. No sprawling yards. No communal dining halls. Just reinforced concrete, razor wire, and silence. Inmates spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. Meals arrive through a narrow slot in a solid steel door. There are no trays passed hand to hand. No eye contact. No cafeteria noise. Just a gloved hand sliding food through a slit in the door. 3 times a day. Breakfast might be powdered eggs, dry toast, and a small carton of milk. Lunch, beans, rice, and processed meat. Dinner, pasta, vegetables, a piece of fruit if the budget allowed it. Every meal portioned. Every item logged. At least on paper. The inmate who stopped eating, we'll call him Daniel, had been housed in the control unit. The highest level. The inmates there weren't petty offenders. They were gang leaders, terror convicts, organized crime architects. Men considered too dangerous for any other federal prison. Daniel had not been known for discipline problems. No recent violent incidents. No history of self-harm. But his meal trays had started coming back nearly untouched. At first, guards documented it as refusal. Then as partial intake. Then as monitor. By the time medical staff intervened, Daniel's weight had dropped dramatically. His cheekbones sharpened. His eyes hollowed. When officers entered his cell for a wellness check, the tray from the previous evening still sat near the door. Congealed beans. Hardened rice. A slice of bread turned stiff as cardboard. The question wasn't just why he wasn't eating. It was what had changed. Inside ADX, routine is everything. Meals are delivered at strict times. Calories are calculated to meet federal dietary standards. Nutrition charts are approved centrally. Vendors are contracted through federal supply chains. Nothing is supposed to be random. But one correctional officer, a veteran named Morales, noticed something subtle. The meal packaging labels had changed suppliers 2 months prior. Different lot numbers. Slightly different expiration codes. Most staff wouldn't care. Morales did. He had worked in state prisons before transferring to federal service. He knew inmates could trade, hoard, manipulate food. But in Supermax? There's no trading. No sharing. No black market. Unless something else was happening. Meanwhile, Daniel's decline became impossible to ignore. Medical staff documented signs of weakness, dizziness, muscle deterioration. Blood tests showed vitamin deficiencies inconsistent with standard meal plans. On paper, the menu met requirements. In his bloodstream, something didn't add up. The Bureau of Prisons opened a quiet internal review. Not public. Not announced. Just paperwork moving through fluorescent-lit offices. They pulled food supply records. Shipment logs. Vendor contracts. Temperature storage reports. Everything looked compliant. But Daniel wasn't the only one losing weight. 2 other inmates in separate housing units showed similar patterns, not starvation, but unexplained deficiencies. Complaints about taste, texture, smell. One described the beans as metallic. Another said the milk burned. Complaints in prison are common. Manipulation tactics even more so. But medical charts don't lie easily. The facility's food service manager insisted the menus were federally approved. Meals were prepared in controlled kitchens. Ingredients were sourced through authorized vendors. Still, a quiet request was made: send random samples for independent testing. The trays were collected from different housing units. Labeled. Sent to a regional lab. Results took weeks. In the meantime, Daniel's condition worsened. He began refusing even water at times. When a psychologist attempted evaluation through the cell door, Daniel's response was simple: "It's not food." He wouldn't elaborate. Inside a place built on isolation, paranoia is common. Inmates distrust staff. They suspect tampering, poisoning, conspiracies. But paranoia doesn't create chemical imbalances in blood work. The lab report arrived on a Thursday morning. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Nutritional degradation beyond acceptable federal variance. Protein content lower than labeled. Certain vitamin levels inconsistent with supplier documentation. Nothing toxic. Nothing overtly poisonous. But not what the paperwork claimed. The vendor responsible had recently won a cost reduction contract. Millions saved annually by restructuring food procurement for several federal facilities. Savings rarely come without trade-offs. The Bureau of Prisons escalated the matter quietly. Auditors requested deeper inspection of the supply chain. Warehouses were visited. Storage units inspected. In one facility hundreds of miles from Florence, inspectors found pallets of bulk ingredients labeled for federal distribution. Expiration dates close. Packaging inconsistent. Still within technical limits. But barely. Meanwhile, Daniel collapsed in his cell during a routine check. Medical intervention came fast this time. For fluids. Emergency transfer within the facility. He survived. Barely. And when he was stabilized enough to speak clearly, he repeated the same phrase he had told the psychologist days earlier. "It's not food." That statement, simple as it was, carried weight. Investigators returned to the lab. They requested expanded testing, not just for nutritional value, but for contaminants, additives, preservative levels. The second round of testing uncovered something more concerning. Elevated levels of certain industrial stabilizers, legal in small quantities, but higher than standard in multiple samples. Not lethal, but enough to alter taste. Enough to potentially degrade nutrient absorption over time. The vendor claimed supply chain inconsistencies, storage issues, transportation variables. Nothing intentional, nothing criminal. Yet the timeline aligned too closely with the contract shift. Cost cutting, bulk substitutions, formula alterations. Inside ADX Florence, inmates have no alternative food source unless they qualify for limited commissary privileges many control unit inmates do not have. If the tray through the slot is compromised, there is no backup. And then came the detail that changed everything. During a routine inventory audit, Morales noticed that one shipment logged as delivered to ADX had never actually arrived at the facility's internal storage. The paperwork showed receipt. The physical inventory did not. The discrepancy wasn't massive. Not enough to trigger alarms in a federal budget system handling millions of dollars. But it was real. A shipment billed. A delivery logged. No physical trace. When investigators traced the shipment route, it led to a private distribution warehouse operating under subcontract. The warehouse was compliant on the surface. But when auditors opened a secured storage room in the back, separate from standard inventory, what they found shifted the entire investigation. Boxes labeled for federal Supermax distribution stacked alongside repackaged bulk goods with altered labeling. And some of those altered labels matched the lot numbers delivered to ADX Florence. On paper, everything met federal guidelines. In reality, the supply chain had fractures. And if food could be quietly substituted without detection, what else could be? The investigation was no longer about an inmate refusing meals. It was about how a fortress designed for control might have overlooked something fundamental: sustenance. Because when they compared the altered lot numbers with Daniel's medical timeline, the overlap was exact. The trays that entered his cell during the decline came from those shipments. And in a place where every door is steel and every movement monitored, the most dangerous weakness wasn't violence. It was what slid silently through a 6-inch slot 3 times a day. The warehouse discovery didn't trigger sirens. It triggered silence. Boxes stacked behind a locked partition. Federal lot numbers duplicated. Repackaged goods bearing labels that matched shipments sent to ADX Florence. On the surface, it looked like sloppy inventory management. But sloppy doesn't survive long in federal contracting. When auditors cross-referenced the altered lot numbers with Daniel's medical decline, the pattern tightened. Every flagged shipment corresponded to weeks when nutritional markers in multiple inmates dropped below baseline. It wasn't dramatic. No mass illness. No visible outbreak. Just subtle erosion. Weight loss. Vitamin deficiencies. Complaints about metallic taste. Digestive discomfort. Fatigue. Small things in a place built to dismiss small things. The contract responsible for the shipments had been approved 18 months earlier under a cost reduction initiative. Federal prisons across several states were required to trim operational expenses without reducing core service standards. Food budgets are among the largest line items in any correctional system. The company awarded the contract was Nutritional Solutions Group, a private distributor headquartered in Denver. On paper, they specialized in institutional supply chains, hospitals, schools, detention centers. Their proposal promised the same caloric content at lower cost through bulk procurement and streamlined packaging. Savings projected in the tens of millions over 5 years. The contract had passed internal review. Compliance officers signed off. Budget committees approved. Nobody flagged risk. But when investigators dug deeper, they found something curious. The executive who championed the cost-cutting initiative inside the Bureau had left federal service 6 months after the contract was signed. He had taken a private sector consulting role, with a subsidiary linked to Nutritional Solutions Group. The move wasn't illegal. Cooling-off periods had technically been observed. Disclosure forms were filed. But timing has weight. Federal investigators began interviewing mid-level procurement officers. Most insisted the contract met all nutritional standards required by federal guidelines. Testing during the bidding phase had verified caloric content. Calories aren't the whole picture, one internal dietitian said during questioning. Bioavailability matters. Ingredient quality matters. Budget discussions, however, rarely revolve around bioavailability. They revolve around numbers. At ADX Florence, the impact was not immediately visible because the prison environment masks physical decline. Inmates are isolated. Their weight fluctuations aren't seen by peers. There are no communal meals where someone might notice how thin a person looks. A man can deteriorate quietly. Morales, the officer who first noticed the labeling change, was asked to provide a statement. He described subtle differences in packaging texture. A shift from thicker sealed trays to thinner plastic. Slight variation in color of certain processed items. He wasn't a nutritionist. He wasn't a scientist. But he had handled thousands of trays. You notice patterns when repetition becomes routine. Meanwhile, independent laboratory testing expanded. This time, samples were pulled not only from ADX Florence but from 2 other federal facilities using the same vendor. Results showed a consistent pattern. While caloric totals technically met minimum requirements, protein quality was downgraded. Vitamin fortification levels were inconsistent. Some powdered dairy substitutes had higher stabilizer content than labeled. Still legal. Still within broad federal thresholds. But barely. The real concern wasn't poisoning. It was systemic dilution. Cheaper ingredient substitutions that shaved fractions of a cent per serving. Multiply that by thousands of inmates, 3 meals a day, 365 days a year. The savings were enormous. The nutritional compromise? Harder to quantify. Daniel's case remained the catalyst. He had nearly died. His body had become the metric through which the investigation gained urgency. Psychological evaluations eventually determined he had developed distrust toward the food after noticing taste changes. His refusal escalated from skepticism to obsession. In solitary confinement, Perception sharpens without distraction. If something tastes different every day, and you have nothing else to think about, it becomes everything. But Daniel wasn't delusional. The taste had changed. As federal auditors deepened their probe, they discovered another troubling detail. One of the subcontracted warehouses responsible for repackaging bulk goods was owned through a shell corporation tied to a relative of a Nutritional Solutions executive. The arrangement wasn't disclosed during bidding. The repackaging process allowed the company to substitute cheaper bulk ingredients purchased from overseas suppliers. Documentation showed that original labeling often remained intact even when contents had been modified. Not toxic, not contaminated, but downgraded. In institutional settings, the difference between grade A and grade B protein powder is invisible to the naked eye. The difference between fresh milk and shelf-stable substitute is subtle. But over months, inside bodies deprived of variety and sunlight, those differences accumulate. Federal investigators coordinated with the Department of Justice's Procurement Oversight Division. Subpoenas were issued quietly. Emails were requested. Financial records examined. What they found suggested internal awareness. In one email exchange between company executives, a line stood out. Within tolerance margins, substitutions are financially strategic. Tolerance margins. In prison, tolerance is thin. When Nutritional Solutions executives were called in for questioning, they maintained compliance. Every substitution, they argued, fell within federal dietary guidelines. Caloric minimums were met. Contracts did not specify ingredient grade beyond baseline nutritional content. They weren't starving inmates. They were optimizing margins. Meanwhile, inside ADX Florence, word spread among staff that food quality issues were under review. Inmates sensed it too. Meal refusals increased slightly. Complaints logged in greater frequency. The Bureau faced a delicate situation. Public disclosure of nutritional irregularities in the nation's most secure prison would invite scrutiny. Lawsuits. Media attention. Supermax facilities are built on the promise of absolute control. A compromised food supply, even if technically compliant, undermines that narrative. Daniel recovered slowly. Medical intervention restored some weight. Supplements were introduced temporarily. But his statement remained etched in investigators' minds. It's not food. In a system designed to reduce human interaction to bare essentials, food is one of the few remaining human variables. It carries symbolism, trust, power. If inmates believe their sustenance is compromised, stability fractures. The investigation escalated to criminal fraud analysis. Financial audits revealed that Nutritional Solutions had reported higher-grade ingredient purchases to federal regulators than those actually used in repackaging. The price difference was significant. On paper, invoices reflected premium sourcing. In warehouses, bulk generic alternatives were being relabeled. Profit margins widened quietly. The executive who had left the Bureau for consulting work denied knowledge of substitutions. He claimed advisory involvement only in efficiency modeling, not operational decisions. But bank records told a more complicated story. Consulting payments increased sharply after the contract renewal. Performance bonuses aligned with cost reductions achieved through supplier restructuring. It wasn't dramatic corruption. It was gradual erosion, the kind that thrives in bureaucratic blind spots. As the Department of Justice prepared potential charges, a new complication emerged. A whistleblower inside Nutritional Solutions contacted investigators anonymously. He provided internal memos indicating awareness that prolonged reliance on downgraded protein sources could lead to cumulative nutrient absorption issues in high-isolation environments. The memo concluded with a chillingly clinical phrase: impact negligible under standard monitoring intervals. Standard monitoring intervals. Daniel had nearly died between those intervals. The whistleblower's information expanded the scope of the case from contract fraud to potential reckless endangerment. Still, proving criminal intent required more than internal emails. Investigators needed evidence that executives knowingly prioritized profit over inmate health. They scheduled a coordinated inspection of all subcontracted facilities. And just days before the first inspection, one of the smaller repackaging warehouses caught fire overnight. No casualties. Significant inventory damage. Security footage from the exterior cameras had been corrupted. Inside a Supermax prison built to eliminate unpredictability, the chaos was happening far beyond the razor wire. Food, money, paper trails, and a fire that destroyed potential evidence. By the time federal agents secured the site, most of the repackaged goods had been reduced to ash. The official cause was listed as an electrical malfunction. But investigators weren't convinced. Because buried in the partial records recovered from a damaged office cabinet was a spreadsheet outlining adjusted fortification formulas for multiple federal facilities, including ADX Florence. The spreadsheet wasn't dramatic. No bold red warnings. No explicit admissions. Just columns. Facility codes. Ingredient percentages. Adjusted fortification formulas. Cost differentials measured down to fractions of a cent per serving. Next to ADX Florence's code was a line item labeled Isolation Variable. Investigators stared at it for a long time. Isolation Variable. In institutional budgeting language, it sounded harmless. Technical. Analytical. But in a Supermax prison where men spend 23 hours a day alone in concrete boxes, isolation is not a variable. It is the environment. When forensic accountants cross-referenced that spreadsheet with medical reports from ADX Florence, a pattern sharpened into focus. The adjusted formulas allocated slightly lower levels of certain nutrients, particularly fresh source vitamins, to facilities categorized as high isolation. The reasoning, buried in internal memos, was disturbingly pragmatic. Inmates in restricted housing units exhibit lower average physical exertion and reduced caloric expenditure. Formula adjustments permissible within federal minimum standards. In plain terms, the company had calculated that men locked alone in cells moved less, burned fewer calories, required less nutritional density. So they cut it. Legally, they remained within minimum federal thresholds. Ethically, the ground shifted. Daniel's collapse was no longer an isolated anomaly. It was a predictable outcome of a formula designed to meet minimums, not human needs. The Department of Justice escalated the case from procurement fraud to conspiracy charges. Subpoenas widened. Executives were called before a federal grand jury. The former bureau official who had championed the cost reduction initiative faced direct questioning about his knowledge of formula adjustments. He maintained ignorance. He insisted that federal dietary standards were the benchmark, not personal interpretation of quality. But prosecutors introduced internal communications showing that performance bonuses were directly tied to achieving aggressive efficiency targets in high-security facilities. High-security facilities, like ADX Florence. Meanwhile, inside the prison, subtle changes began. Without public announcement, food shipments from Nutritional Solutions were suspended pending review. Emergency sourcing contracts were activated. Fresh produce volumes increased modestly. Protein sources shifted. Inmates noticed. Daniel noticed most of all. When a tray arrived with visibly different packaging, thicker sealed plastic, brighter labeling, he hesitated before touching it. Weeks earlier, he had recoiled from the metallic taste that haunted his senses. Now, cautiously, he took a bite. The difference was subtle, but real. Outside the prison walls, federal agents executed search warrants on Nutritional Solutions headquarters. Servers were seized. Accounting files downloaded. Communications analyzed. The warehouse fire became central to the investigation. Fire marshals revisited the scene. Accelerant traces were inconclusive, but electrical failure explanations grew thin under scrutiny. One internal email surfaced, sent hours before the fire. Inspection risk high. Containment options limited. Containment options. Prosecutors argued it was an indirect acknowledgement of impending exposure. Defense attorneys countered that corporate language often sounds worse than it is. The trial that followed months later was not a spectacle of violence. No graphic images. No emotional witness testimony about physical brutality. Instead, it was numbers. Charts projected onto courtroom screens. Dietary breakdowns. Profit margins mapped against nutrient reductions. If you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe, drop a comment, and stay until the end.